Did you really think no one was watching? The question would haunt Ethan Caldwell long before anyone dared ask it out loud. At exactly 8:17 p.m., inside the crystal-lit dining room of the Sterling House in downtown Chicago, a single sharp sound silenced conversations that had been worth millions of dollars only moments before. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to waiting hands. The jazz trio, near the grand piano, lost its rhythm. Even the servers froze beside polished oak tables dressed in white linen and silver. Every pair of eyes turned toward the center of the room, where Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still, her serving tray trembling ever so slightly in her hands. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply looked ahead, steady and composed, while a faint red mark slowly appeared across her cheek. Across from her stood Ethan Caldwell, the 39-year-old billionaire founder and CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, one of America's fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies. His tailored navy suit fit like armor. His platinum watch reflected the warm chandelier light, and his expression suggested absolute certainty that everyone in the room would accept his version of events without question. That confidence had carried him through hostile boardroom takeovers, billion-dollar acquisitions, and magazine covers celebrating him as the future of American innovation. Tonight, he believed it would carry him through this moment as well. He was wrong. Hidden near the back corner of the restaurant, where the lighting faded into comfortable shadows, a man in a charcoal suit lowered his espresso cup with remarkable calm. Unlike the stunned executives, nervous hotel staff, and startled diners around him, he never looked surprised. His thumb rested lightly against the side of a smartphone, lying almost unnoticed beside the saucer. The recording timer continued counting upward in complete silence. He neither interrupted nor reacted. He simply watched with the patience of someone who had learned that truth often revealed itself without assistance. No one recognized him. Not the maitre d', not the investors gathered around the private dining room. Not even Ethan, whose attention remained fixed on Naomi. Outside, cold November rain streaked across the towering windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Headlights reflected against wet pavement below, while distant sirens blended with the storm into a soundtrack that made the evening feel strangely cinematic. Inside, however, the heavier storm had only just begun. Naomi swallowed once, carefully steadying the water glasses on her tray before they could tip. She had worked enough double shifts to understand that dignity sometimes meant remaining calm when everyone expected you to break. Around her, whispers quietly spread from table to table. Some guests reached for their phones before thinking better of it. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances, silently calculating whether loyalty belonged to wealth or to conscience. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his jacket as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He expected the room to move on. He expected dinner to continue. He expected silence to protect power the way it always had. But across the room, the tiny red recording light on a forgotten phone continued blinking, preserving every second with perfect clarity. And before this night was over, that silent witness would become far more valuable than every signature waiting on the contract stacked inside Ethan Caldwell's leather briefcase. The silence refused to leave the room. It settled over every table like an invisible weight, heavier than the polished chandeliers hanging above the guests. Nobody reached for another bite of food. Nobody laughed. Even the soft jazz that had filled the restaurant only minutes earlier faded into an uneasy background hum. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes for only a moment, not out of shame, but to steady her breathing. Years of working in luxury restaurants had taught her that emotions could spread through a room faster than spilled wine. She carefully placed the silver serving tray onto a nearby service station, straightened the sleeve of her black uniform, and quietly asked, "Would anyone like fresh water?" Her voice remained calm, almost unbelievably calm, and that simple question confused everyone far more than anger ever could have. Ethan Caldwell watched her with growing irritation. He had expected tears. He had expected an argument, perhaps even an apology that would allow the evening to continue exactly as planned. Instead, She behaved as though her dignity belonged to her alone, untouched by anyone else's opinion. That quiet confidence unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Around the private dining room, executives exchanged uncertain glances. Several of them represented investment firms preparing to finalize a partnership worth nearly $2 billion before the evening ended. They had spent months negotiating schedules, projections, and legal details. Yet now every spreadsheet, every presentation, and every carefully rehearsed speech suddenly felt insignificant compared to the uncomfortable silence surrounding Table 12. Restaurant manager Daniel Mercer hurried across the marble floor wearing the practiced smile of a man desperate to restore order. He apologized repeatedly to the guests, assured everyone that the situation had been handled, and gently encouraged Naomi to return to the employee hallway. She nodded politely without offering a single complaint. As she turned toward the service corridor, several employees looked at her with sympathetic eyes, but fear kept every one of them silent. Luxury hospitality depended on reputation, and everyone understood how quickly careers could disappear after the wrong confrontation with the wrong customer. Hidden beneath the shadows near the rear corner, the unknown gentleman continued observing every movement without drawing attention to himself. His phone remained face up beside the untouched espresso, recording steadily as conversations slowly resumed in cautious whispers. One of the security staff approached him and quietly asked whether everything was satisfactory. The gentleman simply smiled, thanked him, and requested another cup of coffee. His voice carried neither anger nor excitement. It carried patience. Outside, the rain intensified, streaking across the towering windows while flashes of distant lightning briefly illuminated the Chicago skyline. The reflections shimmered across the restaurant's polished floor, creating the strange illusion that the entire room stood between two storms, one beyond the glass and another growing quietly inside. Ethan finally reclaimed his seat, loosening his tie just enough to convince himself that control had returned. He reached for the leather folder containing the merger documents and confidently announced that business should proceed without further distractions. Several investors forced polite smiles, yet none immediately reached for their pens. Something invisible had shifted. Trust, once fractured, rarely announced its departure. It simply disappeared, and while Ethan believed the evening was beginning again, the small recording icon glowing silently on a forgotten smartphone suggested that this story had only reached its true beginning. Naomi walked through the service hallway with measured steps, neither rushing nor slowing down, as though the evening still deserved the same professionalism she had brought to every shift. The bright lights above the stainless steel counters reflected against neatly stacked dinner plates, while cooks exchanged quiet glances without asking questions. They had all heard something. They had all sensed the tension. Yet inside restaurants like the Sterling House, survival often depended on pretending not to notice what everyone had already seen. Naomi slipped into the employee break room for only a minute, took a slow breath, and looked at her reflection in the small mirror hanging beside the lockers. Her grandmother used to tell her that dignity was the one uniform nobody could take away. Those words had followed Naomi since childhood through every disappointment, every difficult customer, and every long overnight shift. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she had learned early that life rarely rewarded the loudest voice. Her mother worked double shifts as a city bus driver, while her grandfather repaired heating systems well into his 70s after retirement because the family still needed the income. They never had much money, but they carried themselves with quiet pride. Naomi inherited that same habit. She finished high school with honors, earned a scholarship to study business administration at a community college, and dreamed of opening a neighborhood cafe where every customer would be treated with equal respect, whether they arrived in a tailored suit or worn work boots. Tuition bills, medical expenses for her younger brother Marcus, and rising rent delayed that dream year after year. Waiting tables was never meant to define her future. It was simply the bridge keeping her family together while tomorrow slowly caught up. Back inside the dining room, Daniel Mercer adjusted his tie for what felt like the 20th time that evening. He reminded the staff that important investors remained inside and that flawless service had to continue. Naomi simply nodded, picked up another polished tray, and returned to the floor without complaint. Several guests quietly thanked her as she refilled their water glasses. Others looked away, embarrassed by their own silence. A woman near the window offered a gentle smile that lasted only a second before returning to her conversation. Kindness sometimes arrived in whispers because courage had not yet found its full voice. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell noticed every calm movement Naomi made. The absence of fear frustrated him more than open defiance ever could have. He convinced himself that once contracts were signed and headlines celebrated another successful acquisition, tonight would disappear into memory like countless uncomfortable moments powerful people left behind. He could not see what others were beginning to notice. Confidence built upon unquestioned authority often blinded itself first. In the dim corner of the restaurant, the mysterious gentleman accepted a fresh cup of coffee from a young server and thanked her with genuine warmth. His phone continued resting quietly beside the saucer, capturing every passing minute without interruption. He watched Naomi greet another table with the same grace she had shown before the evening changed. The smallest smile crossed his face, not because he enjoyed conflict, but because character always revealed itself most clearly when nobody expected kindness to survive pressure. Outside, rain continued washing the city streets, while inside, another kind of storm gathered. Without a single raised voice, carrying the unmistakable feeling that fate had quietly taken a seat among the dinner guests. The contracts finally returned to the center of the polished mahogany table, but the confidence that had filled the room before dinner never truly came back. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward with the familiar smile that had persuaded investors, politicians, and technology giants to trust his vision over the past decade. His presentation was polished, every statistic memorized, every projected revenue chart designed to impress. He spoke about innovation, market expansion, and artificial intelligence transforming American industries over the next 5 years. The words were strong, but the room no longer listened with the same certainty. Every few seconds, someone's attention drifted toward Naomi as she quietly continued serving fresh coffee and replacing dessert forks with the same steady professionalism that had never abandoned her. Ethan noticed it. The attention he considered his birthright had begun slipping away, not because Naomi demanded it, but because character has a strange way of becoming impossible to ignore once people have witnessed it under pressure. Irritation slowly settled behind Ethan's carefully controlled expression. He paused midway through explaining a projected earnings model and watched as Naomi politely placed a cup of hot tea before an elderly investor seated near the window. She smiled warmly, wished him an enjoyable evening, and continued to the next table without lingering for recognition. The investor quietly thanked her, then looked toward Ethan with an expression that was no longer entirely convinced. Small moments often reshape enormous decisions. Daniel Mercer sensed the atmosphere changing as well. Every year, he hosted executives worth billions of dollars, and he had developed an instinct for reading rooms before conversations became headlines. Tonight, something invisible had shifted beyond repair. He encouraged the staff to move faster, refill glasses more frequently, and keep every detail flawless, hoping perfect service might erase uncomfortable memories. Instead, every polished plate and every carefully folded napkin seemed to remind the guests that professionalism had come from the people with the least authority in the room. Near the rear corner, the quiet gentleman remained almost unnoticed. His second cup of coffee had grown cold, yet he never seemed interested in drinking it. His attention stayed fixed on the dining room, observing not only Ethan and Naomi, but everyone else as well. He noticed who whispered, who looked away, who offered kindness, and who protected silence. His phone remained resting beside the untouched saucer, its recording continuing without interruption. Occasionally, another elegantly dressed man entered the restaurant, exchanged a respectful nod toward him from a distance, and left without speaking. Few people paid attention to those brief exchanges, but anyone who did would have wondered why successful businessmen, city officials, and even restaurant security greeted the unknown guest with unmistakable respect. Naomi returned to table 12, carrying fresh, sparkling water. She asked politely whether anyone needed anything before dessert arrived. Her calm voice remained unchanged, gentle enough to settle nervous conversations rather than interrupt them. Ethan looked directly at her for a long second, searching for hesitation, resentment, or fear. He found none. Instead, he found quiet confidence, the kind that cannot be purchased, negotiated, or intimidated. For reasons he could not explain, that unsettled him more deeply than any public argument ever could. Beyond the rain-covered windows, Chicago continued moving through another ordinary November evening, unaware that inside one elegant restaurant, reputations, loyalties, and futures were quietly rearranging themselves one silent decision at a time, while the smallest red recording light in the room patiently captured every second of history unfolding before it. By the time dessert menus reached the tables, the conversation had become noticeably different from the one Ethan Caldwell had carefully planned weeks earlier. Financial projections no longer dominated the discussion. Instead, investors asked quieter questions that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or expansion strategies. One executive wondered aloud how leadership revealed itself under pressure. Another casually mentioned that company culture often reflected the behavior of those at the very top. The comments were delivered politely, almost conversationally, yet each one landed with greater weight than any formal challenge inside a boardroom. Ethan answered with practiced confidence, speaking about accountability, excellence, and high standards, but the words sounded strangely detached from the atmosphere surrounding him. Naomi continued moving through the dining room with remarkable composure. She greeted every guest with the same warm professionalism, remembered dietary preferences without checking a notebook, and anticipated requests before they were spoken. An elderly couple complimented the restaurant service. A family celebrating an anniversary thanked her for making the evening feel special. She accepted every kind word with a sincere smile before quietly returning to work. She neither sought sympathy nor attempted to explain what had happened earlier. Her silence carried dignity instead of defeat, and that distinction became impossible to ignore. Daniel Mercer noticed something else beginning to change. Members of the staff, who had spent the evening avoiding eye contact, slowly regained their confidence. A young server who had looked frightened earlier now smiled naturally while delivering coffee. A bartender resumed friendly conversations with guests. The kitchen staff exchanged relieved glances as orders flowed smoothly once again. Naomi's calm presence seemed to steady everyone around her without a single speech or dramatic gesture. Leadership, Daniel realized, sometimes arrived wearing a server's apron instead of an expensive tailored suit. Across the room, the mysterious gentleman finally picked up his phone, glanced briefly at the screen, and locked it again before placing it carefully inside the inner pocket of his jacket. The recording had ended, but his attention had not. A discreet vibration echoed from another phone resting on the table beside him. He read the incoming message, smiled almost imperceptibly, and slipped the device away without replying. Moments later, two well-dressed men entered through the restaurant's front entrance. They did not approach his table. They simply acknowledged him with respectful nods before taking seats near the entrance where they quietly observed the room. Their movements were coordinated without appearing rehearsed, subtle enough that most diners never noticed them at all. Ethan finally reached the closing pages of the merger agreement. He slid the leather folder toward the investors with the confidence of a man expecting signatures within minutes. Instead, the lead investor closed the folder gently without opening it. He thanked Ethan for the presentation and suggested that everyone take a little more time before making such an important decision. The explanation sounded reasonable, but the disappointment on Ethan's face appeared instantly. Billion-dollar opportunities rarely paused without a reason. As thunder rolled softly beyond the rain-covered windows, Ethan followed the investor's eyes and realized they were no longer studying spreadsheets or legal documents. They were watching Naomi thank a departing guest with genuine kindness. For the first time that evening, a question crossed Ethan's mind that money had never forced him to ask before. What if the most important judgment inside this room was no longer about business at all, but about character? And what if someone had quietly preserved every moment needed to prove the answer? The last plates of dessert had barely been cleared when the quiet gentleman finally rose from his chair. He moved without urgency, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit before placing a few crisp bills beneath the untouched espresso cup. The room did not fall silent because he demanded attention. It fell silent because people instinctively noticed the confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice. He walked across the dining room at an unhurried pace, passing tables where conversations gradually faded into whispers. The two men who had entered earlier stood almost simultaneously, maintaining a respectful distance several steps behind him. Their movements were disciplined, almost invisible, yet impossible to mistake once noticed. Daniel Mercer watched them approach with growing curiosity. Something about the gentleman felt strangely familiar, although he could not immediately place the face. Several longtime guests subtly straightened in their seats as he passed, offering polite nods that were returned with quiet courtesy. Ethan Caldwell looked up from the unsigned merger documents, assuming another influential investor had decided to introduce himself. He offered the confident smile that had become second nature after years of public appearances. The gentleman returned the smile politely, but never reached for Ethan's outstretched hand. Instead, he stopped beside Naomi, who had just finished placing fresh coffee before a nearby guest. She looked slightly surprised when the distinguished stranger addressed her first. "Miss Brooks," he said with calm sincerity, "thank you for treating every table with the same respect tonight." Naomi blinked softly. She had never seen him before, yet his tone carried genuine appreciation rather than empty politeness. She thanked him and wished him a pleasant evening, expecting the brief exchange to end there. It did not. The gentleman slowly turned toward Ethan, his expression remaining composed. "Mr. Caldwell," he said evenly, "you have built an extraordinary company." Ethan nodded with visible confidence. "I appreciate that." The gentleman continued, "Success has a way of convincing people that every room belongs to them. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not." Several guests quietly exchanged puzzled glances. The lead investor folded his hands together, watching carefully without interrupting. Daniel Mercer stood completely still behind the service station, sensing that something important was unfolding. The gentleman reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the same smartphone that had rested beside his coffee throughout the evening. He held it naturally in one hand, not as a threat, but as though it were simply another ordinary object. "I believe every important decision deserves complete information," he said. Ethan's confident expression tightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Before anyone spoke again, one of the investors quietly whispered a name that traveled through the room faster than any announcement. "That is Vincent Moretti." Another guest slowly repeated it under his breath. Within seconds, recognition spread from table to table. Even those who had never met him knew the reputation of the private businessman whose investments quietly reached industries across the country and whose influence rarely appeared in newspapers because he preferred results over publicity. Vincent Moretti paid no attention to the whispers. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan with remarkable calm. "There is something you should see," he said softly, lifting the phone only slightly. "Because sometimes the smallest moments become the ones that define an entire future." Around the dining room, nobody reached for a chair, a drink, or a document. Every heartbeat seemed to pause together as the screen illuminated Vincent's face with a quiet glow, and for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell realized that control had silently changed hands long before anyone had noticed. Vincent Moretti touched the screen once, and the display came to life with crystal-clear video captured from the quiet corner where he had spent the evening unnoticed. He did not raise the phone above his head or make a dramatic announcement. Instead, he calmly handed it to the lead investor seated closest to him. "Please," he said politely, "watch from the beginning." The investor accepted the device without hesitation. His expression changed within seconds. The confidence he had shown throughout the negotiations slowly gave way to thoughtful silence. When the recording ended, he passed the phone to the executive beside him without saying a single word. One by one, the device moved around the table. No one rushed. No one spoke. Every guest watched the same sequence unfold with complete clarity. There were no confusing camera angles, no missing moments, and no opportunity for misunderstanding. The recording simply preserved exactly what had happened, followed by everything that came afterward. It showed Naomi returning to her work with professionalism despite the uncomfortable situation. It showed the staff struggling to restore calm. It showed Ethan confidently attempting to continue business as though nothing important had occurred. Most importantly, it revealed something no financial report could ever measure: character. Ethan remained standing, his hands resting lightly against the back of his chair. He searched the faces around the room, expecting someone to dismiss the recording as an isolated misunderstanding. No one did. The lead investor finally placed the phone carefully on the table and folded his hands together. "Business decisions are built on trust," he said quietly. "Technology can be audited. Financial statements can be reviewed. Leadership is much harder to replace once confidence is lost." Another executive nodded in agreement. A woman representing one of the largest investment firms in the room closed her notebook before speaking. "We came here prepared to invest in a company. Tonight, we discovered we were also investing in the judgment of the person leading it." Her words were calm, respectful, and impossible to ignore. Around the dining room, conversations stopped completely. Even guests with no connection to the meeting sensed that something significant had changed. Daniel Mercer stood motionless near the service station, watching years of executive confidence dissolve not through confrontation, but through undeniable evidence and measured reflection. Naomi remained where she was, holding a coffee pot beside a nearby table. She never stepped forward to defend herself. She never asked anyone to take her side. She simply waited quietly, allowing the truth to speak without assistance. Vincent looked toward her with quiet approval before returning his attention to Ethan. "Power often convinces people that witnesses do not matter," he said evenly. "Experience has taught me the opposite. Someone is always watching, especially when respect is tested." Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time that evening. The carefully rehearsed certainty that had defined every meeting, every interview, and every negotiation seemed strangely distant now. Outside, the rain continued falling. Across the Chicago skyline, washing the streets beneath thousands of glowing lights. Inside the Sterling house, another kind of cleansing had begun. It did not arrive through raised voices or public humiliation. It arrived through truth, patience, and the quiet realization shared by every person in the room that reputations are not protected by wealth alone. They are protected by the choices people make when they believe no consequence will ever reach them. No one reached for the unsigned contracts again. The thick leather folder remained exactly where Ethan Caldwell had placed it, yet it no longer carried the promise of a historic business agreement. It had become little more than another object resting on polished wood while every meaningful decision unfolded somewhere beyond the printed pages. The lead investor slowly closed the folder and slid it back across the table with deliberate care. "Our firms will be postponing today's vote," he said in a calm, measured voice. "This is not a financial decision. It is a leadership decision." The words echoed through the dining room with surprising gentleness, making them even more difficult to dismiss. One by one, the other executives quietly agreed. Nobody argued. Nobody attempted to embarrass Ethan. There was simply a shared understanding that trust, once questioned, deserved time before another signature was written. Ethan opened his mouth to explain, but every carefully prepared sentence suddenly sounded inadequate. Balance sheets could answer questions about profit. They could not answer questions about judgment. Across the room, Daniel Mercer released a slow breath he had been holding for what felt like hours. He watched the investors gather their notebooks instead of their pens, realizing that the evening had changed directions without a single dramatic confrontation. Several guests quietly stood to leave, pausing only long enough to thank the restaurant staff for their hospitality. More than one guest offered Naomi a warm smile before walking toward the entrance. Their gestures were small, almost ordinary, yet each one carried quiet recognition for the grace she had shown throughout the evening. Naomi responded exactly as she had all night, thanking every guest sincerely and wishing them a safe trip home. She never mentioned the recording. She never mentioned Vincent Moretti. She never spoke about herself at all. Vincent observed the scene with thoughtful eyes before turning toward Daniel. Your staff handled an uncomfortable situation with remarkable professionalism, he said. Please make certain they know someone noticed. Daniel nodded gratefully, understanding that those few words carried more value than public praise. They acknowledged the invisible effort that often went unseen inside the hospitality industry, where respect was expected to flow in only one direction. As the room slowly emptied, Ethan remained standing beside the table, overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. The city lights reflected across the windows, blurring into long streams of gold and white against the glass. His phone vibrated several times inside his jacket. Incoming messages from board members, assistants, and business partners continued arriving one after another. He looked at the screen, but did not answer. For the first time in many years, immediate responses no longer felt capable of repairing what had quietly unraveled before his eyes. Vincent approached him one final time, his expression neither cold nor triumphant. Every successful person eventually faces a moment that cannot be solved with influence, he said softly. The fortunate ones recognize it before they lose everything that truly matters. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched as Vincent turned toward the entrance, where the two well-dressed men opened the door without being asked. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, leaving the streets glistening beneath the city lights. Inside, something far more lasting remained behind. Wealth had filled the room at the beginning of the evening. By its end, the only currency anyone still respected was integrity, and every person walking out into the Chicago night understood that they had witnessed a lesson no business school could ever teach. The dining room gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but nobody who had shared that evening would ever remember it as an ordinary business dinner again. Employees quietly polished the last wine glasses, folded fresh linen across empty tables, and prepared the restaurant for another day. Naomi Brooks finished her final task exactly as she finished every shift, checking each station to make certain the next team would begin with everything in order. She gathered her notebook, thanked every coworker who had stood beside her throughout the evening, and picked up her coat without asking for recognition or sympathy. As she reached the front entrance, a calm voice spoke behind her. "Miss Brooks." She turned to see Vincent Moretti standing a few feet away beneath the warm glow of the lobby lights. He smiled with the same quiet composure he had carried all night. "You reminded everyone here that respect is not measured by a job title," he said. Naomi returned a gentle smile. "My grandmother always told me that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you say." Vincent nodded thoughtfully. She was a wise woman. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Beyond the glass doors, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath the city lights. "Do not let tonight change who you are," Vincent continued. "The world already has enough people chasing power. It will always need more people who protect dignity." Naomi thanked him sincerely, then stepped outside into the cool November air, drawing a deep breath that felt lighter than any she had taken all evening. Behind her, Ethan Caldwell remained alone inside the nearly empty dining room. The unsigned contract still rested on the table where opportunity had quietly slipped away. He looked through the tall windows and watched Naomi disappear into the crowd, carrying nothing except her purse and her quiet confidence. For the first time in many years, He understood that influence could open doors, but character determined who deserved to walk through them. He slowly gathered the merger documents, not with frustration, but with reflection. Success had always been measured in market value, acquisitions, and headlines. Tonight, another measurement had revealed itself, one that could not be calculated on any spreadsheet. Daniel Mercer approached and thanked him politely for visiting the restaurant. Ethan paused before answering. "Please tell Miss Brooks that I appreciate her professionalism this evening." Daniel nodded. "I will." It was not a perfect apology, nor did it erase what had happened, but it was the first honest sentence Ethan had spoken all night. Outside, the first hints of dawn began softening the eastern horizon above Chicago, promising another ordinary morning for millions of people who would never know the story that had unfolded inside one elegant restaurant. Yet everyone who had witnessed those quiet hours carried the same lesson home. Wealth can command attention. Position can inspire obedience. Fame can fill a room with admiration. But none of them can replace simple human respect. Because in the end, people rarely remember who held the most power. They remember who chose kindness when it cost something, who protected another person's dignity when silence would have been easier, and who discovered that the greatest victory is never proving you are above someone else, but proving that no amount of success is greater than treating another human being with grace.